I'm so delighted to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Stephanie Sparling Williams, and she'll in turn introduce Lorraine. Stephanie joined the Mount Holyoke College Art Museum as Associate Curator in June of 2019, so less than a year ago. At Mount Holyoke, she is leading acquisition initiatives that bring greater diversity to the museum's collections, with a focus on work by women-identified artists of color. Two spectacular recent purchases by the artists Bisa Butler and Harmonia Rosales are on view right now in Mount Holyoke, and I urge you to go see them the next time you make a trip to South Hadley. To this work at Mount Holyoke, Stephanie brings deep expertise as a scholar, educator, and curator who is committed to transforming art and its institutions. As a specialist on the work of Lorraine O'Grady, and as a contributor to the Black Refractions catalog, she is also the author of the forthcoming manuscript, Speaking Out of Turn, Lorraine O'Grady and the Art of Language. The book deepens the accomplishments of her dissertation, in which she studied how 5 different contemporary artists, Adrienne Piper, Shireen Nishat, Carrie Mae Weems, Coco Fusco, and Lorraine O'Grady, engage with race, gender, and modes of address. Stephanie is also an active member in the College Art Association's Committee on Women and the Arts, which promotes the scholarly study and recognition of women's contributions to the visual arts. She earned her PhD in American Studies and Ethnicity from the University of Southern California and a BA in Ethnic Studies and Fine Art from the University of Colorado, Boulder. Prior to joining the Mount Holyoke Museum, she held positions at the Addison Gallery of American Art and the Yale University Art Gallery. Her final exhibition for the Addison, Wayfinding, Contemporary Artists, Critical Dialogues, and the Sydney R. Naffel Map Collection will feature newly commissioned artworks by 6 artists when it opens next month. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Stephanie Sparling Williams.
Thank you so much, Emma, for that warm welcome and very kind and generous introduction. I'm truly thrilled to be here with you all tonight. Thank you for coming out on this sad, rainy day to be in this cold auditorium with us to talk about Lorraine's work. I'm really excited to be in conversation with artist Lorraine O'Grady, whose work I've been thinking about for many years and whose creative practice is starting to receive much deserved and long overdue attention. Lorraine O'Grady is a concept-based artist who began her professional career in the arts in the late 1970s and who continues today to produce artistic and scholarly work. What is clear about Lorraine O'Grady's art is that every aspect is entangled and interconnected, from her early literary cut-ups to boisterous performances to later theoretically dense diptychs. The issues of gender, race, and class are embedded in each project and are conceptually explored through the various mediums O'Grady deploys. A native of Boston, Massachusetts, O'Grady's work involves her heritage as a New Englander and daughter of Caribbean immigrant parents. After she graduated from Wellesley College in 1956, studying economics and Spanish literature, O'Grady served as an intelligence analyst for the US government, a literary and commercial translator, and rock music critic. Turning to the visual arts in the late 1970s, O'Grady became an active voice within the alternative New York art world at the time. In addition to addressing feminist concerns, her work tackled cultural perspectives that have been underrepresented during earlier civil rights and feminist movements. In the 1970s and 80s, like so many Black women artists working in New York, O'Grady's work was largely overlooked. In recent years, however, she has enjoyed greater visibility, and her art is finally being widely exhibited and more robustly engaged in both art media and scholarship. Indeed, O'Grady's impressive interdisciplinary and tremendously significant body of collages, performances, and photo-based installations is being exhibited nationally and internationally. A selection of these exhibitions containing O'Grady's work in the last 3 years include Harlem in situ at the Addison Gallery of American Art, Soul of a Nation, Art in the Age of Black Power, which was traveling across the nation and from the Tate Modern. She Persisted, A Century of Women Artists in New York, 1919 to 2019 at Gracie Mansion in New York. Black Refractions, highlights from the Studio Museum in Harlem, which is here on campus. Please go see it if you haven't. I Am You, You Are Too at the Walker Arts Center, and We Wanted a Revolution, Black Radical Women, 1965 to 1985 at the Brooklyn Museum. Additionally, the Brooklyn Museum is scheduled to open the first comprehensive overview of the artist's work in a retrospective titled Lorraine O'Grady, Both and, on view November of this year into April of 2021. Although the artist is widely known for her early, this is where I'll have to do, there we go. Although she is widely known for her early Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noir project, which is, and a still is on the screen, which includes the work Art Is, also in the Smith College Art Museum, or Smith College Museum of Art, that's the right order, and the Black and White Show. O'Grady's multidisciplinary practice encompassing live performance, video, photo montage, concrete poetry, cultural criticism, and public art has been largely left under-theorized. In recent years, however, her writing has received considered attention, particularly her much anthologized 1992 essay, Olympia's Maid, Reclaiming Black Female Subjectivity, now a feminist art historical mainstay in the field. O'Grady also has a collection of her own writings scheduled to come out this fall from Duke University Press, concurrently with the Brooklyn Retrospective. So there's so much on the horizon and much to be celebrating this year in terms of Lorraine's work. O'Grady's work first came into the Studio Museum collection, the collection that we're celebrating this evening, through the gift of longtime dealer specializing in fine art by African-American Peg Alston. Sisters 4, which was part of Alston's gift, is included in the exhibition that's here on campus and represents one of the first standalone uses of the diptych as form, which we'll get into during the conversation. My first encounter with Lorraine's work was in the context of Bennett Simpson's exhibition Blues for Smoke, on view at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles in 2012. I was captivated and admittedly disturbed by one of O'Grady's diptych photo montages from the series Body is the Ground of My Experience, made in 1991, which I'm also going to put up on the screen. This work depicted a scene of a little boy and girl playing ball in a clearing on the right, with a heap of clothes and a handgun strewn across the grass nearby. In the air, hovering over the tree line, a naked couple embrace, a white male atop a black female, apparently penetrating her. In the second frame on the left, the black female lies in the now empty clearing. Her eyes gaze overhead, unfocused, and she is fondled by the white male who is now in a torn mesh chainmail bodysuit, whose head has been replaced by a human skull. Titled The Clearing, or Cortez and La Malinche, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, N and Me, the work left me conflicted. I was immediately interpolated by the mixed-race couple, a pairing resembling my own parents. However, the bizarre context and title was disorienting. The historical figures O'Grady summons with her framing are Thomas Jefferson, 3rd President of the United States, and Sally Hemings, a woman enslaved to him, 16th century Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortez, and an enslaved indigenous Nahua woman known as La Malinche, who played a key role in his defeat over the Aztecs. Finally, N and Me, the last attribution, presumably coded, but still suggests the identity of the artist and perhaps a past spouse, lover, or friend to whom she draws the powerful comparison. Following my experience with this work, I went searching for more, determined to understand what it all meant, and in the process, I was fortunate enough to have formed a unique relationship with Lorraine herself. This encounter 8 years ago, along with her appearance as a distinguished lecturer during a critical junction in my dissertation research in 2015, really laid the foundations for my own work, which Emma introduced, Speaking Out of Turn, which is currently under review, so stay tuned. Tonight, Lorraine and I will be discussing the significant moment leading up to this Brooklyn Museum retrospective, and how this exhibition and the others I mentioned contributes to the shape and interpretation of her work today, as she and scholars of her work like myself reflect on her 40-year practice. A practice that has been centered on notions of language and the conceptual use of the diptych as form. So please join me in welcoming Lorraine O'Grady to the stage. So, Lorraine, welcome to the Pioneer Valley. We're so happy to have you here, and I want to just dive right in and get you talking about this last few years. It's been really busy for you, and I feel like this leading up to your retrospective is pretty significant for your work, and I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about what this means, this moment to you.
Well, obviously, it's the biggest moment of attention that my work has ever received, so it's a lot of pressure. I began work in the art world in 1980, and I began, it was in the moment of total segregation of the art world. And so basically there were white artists in these galleries and black artists in those galleries. And the only people that were really paying attention to the black artists were the other black artists. And so it was a very homey environment. It was also an environment where you could go home, work alone in your studio because nobody was paying any attention. And that was a very intimate way of working with your work. And then that continued when, after the art world became a little desegregated in 1989, and then another kind of ism kicked in addition to racism. Now there was ageism. So those of us who were older were not really included in the next wave of, or the first wave of desegregation. And so it's only really been recently, in 2008, when I was picked up by a gallery, and that I've actually had this kind of focus of attention. In 2010, I was in the Whitney Biennial, so that was sort of the start of it. And that's really only a decade. And and the attention has meant that I've had to change my way of working. I'm not just this little artist sitting alone, figuring out what they want to do and then doing it by themselves. I was my own studio assistant for 20 years or 30 years. Now I have people working for me, so it's a rather different way of working. It affects the work that I make, and it affects the way in which I think of my relationship to the public, and the way the public relates to me. So one of the things that I'm faced with a retrospective is clarifying this work, which was really always intended primarily for me and for other people like me, but now there are broader people in the audience. And the work has always been, I would say, dauntingly intellectual. In fact, that I started as a performance conceptual artist, and which was sort of about as avant-garde as you could get, and then I began to realize that was a little limited way of approaching art, and I began to. It was also too quick. The ideas were, the viewing of the ideas was so fast that you had to, get it very quickly and move on, and nobody would remember it. And so I began to go to the wall just to hold my ideas still long enough for people to be able to absorb them. And that became a very satisfying way to work, in fact. And I'm more, I would say, a visual artist now than I am a performance artist. But now I've had to sort of start thinking about what does it all add up to, because I have to write a press release. As you know, I've been working on a press release for the last week or so with my gallery and the people at the Brooklyn Museum, and basically, I would say that I'm having to clarify that this way that I had of working, which was very varied, many different bodies of work about different things, taking different approaches, using different media, while I saw them as a unified body of work, nobody else did. For everybody else, it was a group show, right? You know, and when I started to write a press release and to sort of encapsulate this diversity and try to extract from it the unity that actually is there, I had to think about why was it I was making such different work. And I decided, I think, basically that the reason for making so many different kinds of work was that there were so many ways in which this monolithic I won't say presence, it's just the thing that governs us, you know, which is the culture that we find ourselves in, whether we like it or not. This culture is so monolithic that it is able to present an exterior that's actually almost impenetrable. And the reason that it's impenetrable is because it's so chameleonic. It can change shape instantly while still remaining the same. It is permanently the same, constantly changing shape in order to remain the same. And that in order to surround this, this culture, I had to make a lot of incisions, a lot of cuts in different parts of it, you know, to find room for my experience. I began with the assumption that if there wasn't room for me and my experience, that was not my fault, that was its fault. And in order to make room for my experience, I had to conceptualize it in a way that really wasn't the usual way that artists work, which is they find an area and they hone that, they deepen, 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 and get to something that they can say is the truth. I felt that there was something that I had to do, which was a little different, which was to insert as many aspects of my experience as possible in order to loosen this monolithic object up, in order to make room for something that would be more fully me. I did not want to be reduced to my blackness. I did not want to be reduced to my femaleness. I didn't want to be reduced to, you know, one thing or the other. That may have been because I'd always been hybridized, not just physiologically, but I'd been hybridized by having grown up as a Jamaican, the child of Jamaican immigrants in the most New England environment you can possibly imagine, Boston. So I used to say that wherever I stood, I had to build a bridge to some other place. And so this cutting was to make room for all of these various parts of myself. And so when I stood back and I had to, you know, not just thinking about the process of thinking about the press release has been going on for a while now because people have been asking me questions like, you know, like Stephanie, you know, and I started answering these individual questions. And while I had thought that the most important thing that I was doing was inserting my subject matter, I realized that, in fact, the most important thing I was doing was not inserting my content, but my form. And my form was a way of thinking which was antagonistic, perhaps, but certainly not the same as the culture that I was immersed in, which I felt was an either-or binaristic culture. That Western philosophy, Western culture is based on a sort of by definition, hierarchical, either-or binary. It's always good versus evil. It's not good and evil. It's always good versus evil, good better than evil. It's not black versus white, not black and white, white better than black. It's always male versus female, male better than female. it's by definition, the either or is hierarchical. And I felt that it was the structure of Western culture that was determining, causing the problems. This thing that made me, by definition, inferior. This thing that made me, by definition, derivative. This thing that made me, at least certainly in terms of the subjective evaluations of the art world, it made me uninteresting, something that nobody had ever accused me of before. And so I found that it was not my content that I had to really think of in terms of how to effectively, or at least begin, sort of initially, oppose this hierarchical. I don't know. This stability, this impermeability of the culture that we're in to anything outside its own definitions of itself. That the only thing that I could do would be to oppose this with something that I felt was both and, something that was the opposite of either or. And I had always thought in terms of the diptych, and the diptych then became my preferred method of choice, and it was my way of opposition. Now, this is something that I think that is a new way of thinking, a new way of talking, and something that I have to make clear. And this is the moment to do that.
Thank you. That is really interesting that the form you're saying was always there, this way of thinking in diptych. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about when the diptych started to show up in the work, and what the significance of that working through the diptych as both theory and form did for your work.
Well, the first body of work that I actually put out into the public was Mademoiselle Bourgeois Noire. She wore down on a cape made of 180 pairs of white gloves, and she gave people a piece of her mind. And she was frankly, a political character developed to make a political point, and which was against desegregation, against the segregation of the art world as I found it. I first started off with these sort of eponymous performances performed at various spaces. So there was the Mademoiselle Bourgeois Noire performance itself, using the body of the character, and she shouted out poems, giving people a piece of her mind. And then at a certain point, I decided that the shouting out poems wasn't going to work. So they were basically answering the question of what is the problem? Well, the problem is racism, the problem is sexism, and so on. I had to do something which would be more direct, give more direct evidence of what the solutions would be. And so I did the black and white show where I put 14 black artists, 14 white artists on the wall with all their work in black and white, because I just wanted to see what would happen when there was an equal dialogue. I had never seen an equal dialogue in the art world, and so I had to make my own. And that was in 1983, in the spring. And then in the fall, I said, well, who should be the audience? Who is the audience? And that became Art Is. Okay, which you, I think, know, right? Do you have a picture of any of the artist pieces?
The Art Is pieces we don't have in the slide, unfortunately, but
in your collection
they are in the Smith collection. So,
yeah,
and in Mount Holyoke. I don't know how this, yes. I was trying to get to the slide where Sisters 4,
yeah,
which is on view in the Studio Museum show. This was the first, if I remember correctly, the standalone where you have two images juxtaposed side by side, doing the work.
This happened because, I was about to say that, while I was doing political work, and the only real directly political work I think I've done, it has been the Mademoiselle Bourgeois project, or trilogy, as some people would call it. When I finished that, I knew that I had said everything I needed to say or wanted to say about the situation. And then I returned to what my real impulse was, which was to explain the world to me. And because that's who I needed, that's who I was trying to, elucidate, right, or inform myself by making art. And the first idea that I had was to do a quadriptych of performances called Indivisible Landscapes. And the first one was going to be called River's First Draft. And I didn't get to that because I finally got to it, I would say, because I would get ahead of myself, but nothing actually ever goes sequentially in the way that you think it will go. So first there was the Mademoiselle Bourgeois project, and then I was at Just Above Midtown, and they said, "Can you do another performance for us in 3 months when we're hosting a performance series here?" And so I had to do something rather quickly, and I had just bought this book about Nefertiti in a used bookstore in San Francisco, and I said, "Oh, I'll do a piece called Nefertiti Devonia Evangeline." And so that's where I started, and I set that performance up as diptychs, about 65 pairs of matching images, and but it was a performance, and it was fast, and it was too, I felt, complex. Somebody told me you would already have to have questions so much before you would even understand what was being questioned here, right? And I said, how do I make this simpler so that you can see it long enough to see what's being questioned, And that's when I took about almost 14 years after I did the performance, I made a miscegenated family album. And the first part of that, I guess in 1988, which was a little sooner than I did the full thing, was the Sisters quadriptych. And this was the core, I thought. This was the core of what the piece was about. What the piece was about in some ways, I had a problematic relationship with my sister that I was trying to work through. And what it was about was the difference between the sisters you're born with and the sisters you choose. And so this was about Nefertiti and Devonia choosing each other and leaving me and Najmet to our own devices, right? That's here. But it was also about bringing into relationship people who I thought could be sisters, people who I thought who helped me resolve my relationship with my sister, because I was able to assume or think that Nefertiti had a similar relationship with her sister Najmet, who was 6 years younger. So the pairing of these images was very natural for me. I always thought of my sister as looking like Nefertiti, so why not make a piece about that, or partially about that, and everything else that could come out of that. And I think I did that. I think I did this piece with diptychs because that was the way I always thought. I mean, I think you asked me, well, how did I arrive at the concept of diptychs? I didn't. I just always had it. So that when from the minute I really started making work for myself, it took the form of making diptychs.
Thank you. I don't know that the slides are going to cooperate because I'm having a moment with them too. Oh, of course. Yeah. There we go. I just need to speak ill of the projector. It still doesn't like me. But I want to take a moment to discuss your pivotal project that you mentioned, River's First Draft. And for those who are unfamiliar, Rivers was a one-time site-specific performance in Central Park and included a highly complex script, hired actors, an assortment of props and a simultaneous and multisensory enactments that you've said on multiple occasions has been one of your most capacious articulations of the diptych as an idea, as a concept. I was wondering if you can elaborate, sharing what it was about this particular. So there's 2 slides of the, I think it's 46 or 48 in this series. What it was about this particular performance that catalyzed the greater exploration of the side-by-side arrangements in your work moving out of this moment. So this was an early performance that resulted, or that you were talking about being as kind of a cornerstone in your process.
Well, this was about me, not about my sister. This was about me, and it was. So it had 2 parts to it. There were 2 different things that were going on in it. It was an overloaded performance. I was perhaps trying to say too much, but it was large enough to get in all the ideas that I wanted to work with for the future. So at one level, the piece was about reconciling 2 different parts of my heritage. Being raised in a West Indian home, a Jamaican home, set in the middle of a New England cultural atmosphere where I went to school, where my classmates and my friends on the block were all from. And trying to accommodate the differences between those 2 was been a lifetime project, really. Trying to get you can't imagine 2 more different places than New England and the Caribbean, and they somehow both exist in me. And there was that double accommodation. And here on the left is the sort of West Indian part of myself, which is as a foremother, this woman, the woman in white, who is grating coconut in her white kitchen, and you never hear her speak during the entire performance. All she does is grate coconut, right, until it starts to pile up around her. And then the New England character, who is the Nantucket Memorial statue, and he's standing very motionlessly in the stream, and he stays like that for the entire performance until he sort of wakes up at the end and comes to rescue me. Okay. So there were these 2 figures. On the soundtrack, there was West Indian music. There was
Radio station, wasn't it? It was like a West Indian radio station.
Yeah, there was a West Indian radio station. There was Jimmy Cliff singing, "The Harder They Come," or whatever. And then there were I don't know, was that Boy George or who? It was Culture Club. Yeah. So anyway. There was all of this action going on, and there were white art snobs, and there were black artists and so forth. So there were a lot of dualities throughout the action. But the primary action was itself a diptych, which is pulling together, reconciling New England and the West Indies. But then there was also a tripartite part, which was based sort of on the Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, who was the futurist who did these 3-ring performances where action takes place on the stage in 3 different sections, and it's all totally different. I had a 3-ring performance going on where I had myself at about 10 or 12, as a little girl.
Girl in the pink sash.
The little girl in the pink sash. And then there is the teenager in magenta, and she's having her love affairs there. And then there is the woman in red, who is trying to get out of this debauched life that she's been living.
Played by yourself.
Huh?
You played the woman in red.
Yes, I played the woman in red. Actually, this piece is actually a prequel to Mademoiselle Bourgeois, because it's the woman in red has to escape from this debauched life to claim herself as an artist. And she does this by painting her own stove red, as opposed to her mother's color, which is white, right? And so when she claims herself, then she's able to join with her other selves, her teenage self and her childhood self, and together they go down, all three of them go down the stream, and when they get to the end, metaphorically, that's when the woman in red can become Mademoiselle Bourgeois.
So it's like an ontological reconciliation.
Yes, exactly. Thank
Easy
you.
peasy, right?
Thank you.
I just want to be mindful of time because I have a longer question, but I know we would like to open up to the audience questions. So I'm going to ask one more question and then I'm going to open it up. This is something that I discovered a letter of yours to Tony Whitfield in 1983 that's really kind of guided my own explorations of your work. And I don't know if guided's the right word, but I think it's bookended. So in my conclusion, this letter really plays a central role in my understanding of your audience. And so in 1983, you prophesize the coming or the arrival of an audience of the future for your early work. Most of the work that we've talked about tonight really hasn't had an audience until the early 2000s, when, for many reasons, WAC and the Whitney Biennial included, kind of led people to your website and to your work. So before that, though, in '83, you were prophesying this audience to come. And I'm going to quote this letter, some chunks of this letter, before I ask my question. So Lorraine writes, "Right now, my goal is to discover and create the true audience. And something tells me that, for a Black performance artist of my ilk, this will take a many-sided approach. Because I sense that the true audience may be coming, not here now, I try to document my work as carefully as I can." You continue later on. "I'm concerned about the future audience of the work, about those who will know," and here she's drawing upon Martin Heidegger, this idea that he has the standing within a work can only be achieved through the profoundest identification with the work, not just its form, but its content as well. And it's precisely this sort of identification that is hardest for the avant-garde Black artist to come by. For one can only succeed in knowing at this depth if one is seeking to know his or herself. So I'm curious, Lorraine, do you feel like that audience has arrived?
Certainly, you've arrived.
It's me, I'm here.
I mean, well, I'm lucky that I've lived long enough to see some of it seen some of the arriving process at any rate. My goodness, have you been hearing me before earlier? Okay.
Yes.
I'm suddenly booming. I think that sometimes I think that 50% of the people who are interested in me are interested in me because of the fact I've had so many careers. As they think that's that gives them hope, right? But I do think that this business of constantly changing is something that I know that you all know that from your own families that people used to have a job, right after college or high school or whatever, and stay in it until they're retired. And that was an expectation in life, that you would just find the thing and just stay there. And it gradually became so that people are changing jobs every 2 or 3 years now, and not unusual. So that the world has changed in that way. In the effort to actually find oneself has become perceived as a much more complex operation. And that people do move in order to keep learning more about themselves and about the world that they inhabit. So I always did that. I always gave myself about 5 years to stay in one place and then move. And also I would the the fact that I have been probing in my art in all these different ways is something which has begun to have resonance, in the sense that I would say that younger people now realize, or I would say more people of more different kinds are finding life more difficult and more complicated than they used to, than previous generations did. So that younger people, millennials, are much more able to understand my movement, which is something that I think is still difficult for many people to understand. How you would move from one, how instead of the normal way of becoming an accomplished or a completed artist is by boring in depth. Okay, going down, down, down. I'm not a depth artist. I'm a breadth artist. And I feel that encompassing more is a way of getting, I don't believe in the deep truths, you understand? Right now, I only believe in the process of constantly relativizing in order to keep up with the changes in morality and in life and in everything else that we're facing, that we have to keep moving in order to keep abreast. So I'm a breadth artist. And this is something I think that more people have now the capacity to understand than they would have certainly 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, I would say.
And just really quickly to piggyback off of that, the internet really has changed so many artists' practice in these last, I would say, 10, 15 years. But for you, I think people, despite the work being made in the 80s and 90s, people really came to your work. You were one of the early artists using the internet to kind of create a digital archive of not only your work, but your writing. And so you describe that process as intentional and as ready-making, so making a way for your audiences to engage with you in this now 21st century. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you knew or how you perceived the internet would affect your work and your 21st century audiences.
Well, you know, I came 2008 and I realized that nobody knew who I was, right? And I had all this work behind me. I mean, everything that I'm sort of well known for now was already done, you know, in the early 80s, actually. So my first job was to reclaim my work, you know, and I found the internet as a sort of an ideal way to do that, because the internet has the capacity to hold everything still on a linear line. Do you understand? Everything was all there at the same time. It was like the diptych, you know, multiplied by 100, right? And so that you could see all of it at once. You could dip in and out of it, and that the internet worked in some ways that way for me. But you know, there still is the world of money, which operates a little bit differently, a little bit more slowly, and so I faced also that I had one of the better websites, I would have to say. I mean, it's not, I don't say it, but most people say that, right? You know.
You said it.
But at the same time, I thought, well, I put it all out there. Everybody should know all of it. No, I was still stuck with the slow presentation of the work by my gallery. You know, one show every 2 or 3 years. So one body of work would get recuperated, and then another, you know, take a little while longer, so that the actual I'm still in the process now of printing work that basically nobody has seen since 1991, you know. because that's how long it's taken me to get caught up with my old work, you know. So the internet, I thought, was going to make it all available at once, but there's still a lot of other things. But don't kid yourself, it's not the only game in town, the internet, you know. There's a lot of other things that have to accompany that effort.
Thank you. So we have about, I think we did really well. We have about 6 to 10 minutes of questions, depending on if my watch is actually calibrated. But I'd like to take some questions from the audience, continue the conversation. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I just wanted to go back to when you were talking about sort of carving
Could you just
space.
make it a little louder, dear?
Yeah, how you were speaking to carving space for yourself in the art world, and sort of holding your blackness and your femaleness at the same time, but not wanting to be reduced to that. And I wonder if you can speak to the process of like making those incisions.
So the question was about how you create space for both blackness and femaleness in the art world, but she's really interested in you talking more about how you were making those incisions, those interventions. Did I capture that correctly? I'm sorry. So if you could speak a little bit more to
well,
that work.
I don't know that. I think decision making in art is not quite so simple, or sometimes it's not. At least not for me. Before I entered the art world, I did a piece called "Cutting Out the New York Times," and
my favorite.
yeah, it was. I had gone to the Iowa Writers Workshop. I don't know if anybody. You've all heard of that, but it was a place where you studied either poetry or fiction or something like that. And I'd gone through the fiction department there, but I hadn't really. I wasn't a very good writer, so I mean I wasn't a very good novelist. So I had ended up by using my writing mainly for things like rock criticism. You know, I used to write for the Village Voice and Rolling Stone, and then I had. At some point, I realized I started teaching at the School of Visual Arts, and I got very interested in the work, that 20th century movement around futurism, Dada, and surrealism, and all of those ideas. And so I used those ideas to try to connect with myself at a particular moment. And this moment was, I thought I could, I don't know why, but how it literally happened was that I made a newspaper poem. I don't know if you've all heard of newspaper poems, or you cut out headlines and you either shake them up in a hat, as they say, or you throw them on the floor, and you pull together something that makes sense. You either leave them random or you pull something together that makes more sense. And I decided, I did my first newspaper poem for Cutting Out the New York Times on the occasion of having, I had a lump in my breast. And this was the moment when the doctors would just simply do mastectomies. Even even before they had found anything. Do you understand? Even before they'd done a real biopsy, or if they'd done a biopsy and they found that there was anything, they would just remove the breast. And I had said to this doctor, "Do not do that. No matter what you find, I want you to tell me what's going on, and then I'll go under the anesthesia again if I want to. I do not want to go in for a biopsy and wake up without a breast." I don't know where I got that courage from, do you know what I mean, to dictate to a doctor. And so I came out of the anesthesia, and I looked down, and I still had both breasts. And so I decided, I was reading the Sunday Times, and I saw this line, "The doctor is operating again." And I said, oh, that's a great line for a poem. And then I I'd been teaching these newspaper poems in my class at SVA. So I said, why don't I make one and give him that as a present?
Because you had a secret crush on him.
So I made this sort of long poem out of the New York Times and these headlines, and the last line of it was, and the doctor is operating again. And then I thought, I looked at it and I said, this poem is just too good to give to him. So I made a Xerox copy of it and I gave him that, but I kept the collage. And then I said, this is really interesting. So I started making these poems, one a week every Sunday for 26 weeks. I just used the entire New York Times, advertisements, book review section, every section. And when I got through it, I realized that this was a very feminist piece. And it was feminist because it had started in a crisis of the female body. It was also happening when I was maybe 43 years old, and a moment when you start to feel the loss of your power, that sexual power that you've counted on without thinking about it, and then suddenly you feel it slipping away. They don't look the way they used to look. You don't have the success with each guy you sleep with that you used to have. It was a total devastation to me to lose that power, or to feel myself losing that power. And so whether I thought about it or I didn't think about it, this work that was being done, it's sort of like, using random language, ended up by being a totally feminist piece. And then, so to say that I chose to privilege gender, no, I didn't. It chose me. Then I went into the art world and I started facing a situation that I had never faced in my life before, because every time I had ever done anything, there had been an objective measure of my accomplishment. I had SAT tests, I had GMAT tests, I had tests to get into the federal government. All of these things were statements about my capacity, and either you could translate something accurately or you couldn't translate something accurately. There was always objective measurements of my capacity. It was only when I got to the art world that I found that all of the measurements of my capacity were subjective, and that really made me furious. And so the next bodies of work were very black.
Thank you. I think we have time for just one more question. And I argue in my own work, just while she's getting the mic passed around, that first project actually, too, was, situated as a black feminist project. Yeah. I don't think that they were wholly privileged as one thing.
It was much more female than
right.
It was black. And then the next one was more black than female. Somebody said that maybe sometimes when you're thinking about gender, you don't have time for race or you don't have space for race, but I think that's not true.
Yeah, I don't believe that either. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
This is funny. So you talk about being a concept-based artist, and you go from performance art to, as you say, more physical, visual art. And you talk about how performance art didn't do with your concepts, or there had to be this kind of transition. Performance art was lacking in explaining your concepts, and you talk about it being like they're too quick. And I'm wondering if you could, what you thought about what concepts are inherent in performance art as an art form, and what concepts are inherent in more physical traces, such as text or visual work.
Did you hear?
Could you summarize that?
So she's interested in the transition you made between performance art and the 2D works that started to end up on the gallery walls. And she's interested in how you moved between the forms, and if there is something inherent in performance as a medium, and if there's something inherent as the 2D diptych as it conveying your ideas. Did I capture that?
Yeah.
Maybe
Well,
too wide.
Obviously, as I said, I think that the first reason for going to the wall is still the main reason for going to the wall, which is to hold complex ideas still long enough so that people can get them, right? You know, that was the first reason. But I have to confess that one of the things that's going to happen in my retrospective is that I'm going back to performance for the first time since Mademoiselle Beauchamp's Noir, basically, and
I think people are going to be very excited about that.
yeah, and this is so much. That's not so much. That's not so much. That's not a hit and run object. That's basically to embody everything. Do you understand?
So performance also, while it can be this very quick, and you refer to your performance as Madame Bourgeoise Noir as like kind of a hit and run, you kind of get, hit them with your content and then you exit. You're saying that you're now going to use performance as a way to hold
Yes.
space for all of your practice.
Yes, exactly.
Which I think is very interesting, given what you've said about being a performance artist in the past.
Yeah.
That's really great. So I want to honor this program is now over, and we are right at time. But if you have other questions or you'd like to engage, we'll be around for a few more minutes. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Thank you.